Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy History Channel. Tonight we journey deep into the emerald heart of Mesoamerica, beneath the thick, humid canopy of the rainforest, to uncover the quiet mysteries of the Maya civilization. When I reflect on this ancient world, it strikes me that so much of what we call history is often just a list of dates and battles. But true history, the kind that settles into your bones and helps you drift off to sleep, is found in the everyday breath of the people who walked the earth thousands of years ago. I find it truly fascinating how a civilization so incredibly advanced, so deeply attuned to the mathematical heartbeat of the cosmos, could thrive in one of the most unforgiving environments on the planet. We often think of great empires rising in open river valleys or gentle temperate plains, but the Maya built their towering achievements amidst the dense, sprawling jungles of what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. Imagine, if you will, standing on the floor of that ancient forest. The air around you is thick, wrapping around your shoulders like a warm, heavy blanket. The scent of damp earth, sweet decaying wood, and blooming orchids fills your lungs with every slow breath you take. High above you, the canopy is a chaotic ceiling of vibrant green, a woven tapestry of mahogany and cedar branches that filters the fierce tropical sun into soft, dappled beams of golden light. This light dances across the forest floor, illuminating the ferns and the moss-covered stones. This was the womb of the Maya civilization. They did not conquer the jungle by destroying it. They learned its rhythms, its wet and dry seasons, and they wove their society directly into its dense fabric. Unlike the Romans or the Incas, the Maya never had a single, unified empire ruled by one all-powerful emperor from a central capital. Instead, their world was a vast, complex network of fiercely independent city-states, much like ancient Greece. Cities like Tikal, Palenque, Copan, and Chichen Itza were glittering nodes of culture, trade, and political power, connected by white limestone roads called sapphire-blue, which literally translates to white ways. These roads glowed under the light of the full moon, guiding travelers, merchants, and ambassadors through the pitch-black jungle night. I often picture a lone merchant walking one of those glowing white paths, guided only by the silver light of the stars above, and the familiar, rhythmic chirping of the cicadas in the dark trees. To understand the Maya, we must first look at the very ground beneath their feet. The Yucatan Peninsula, the northern heartland of their civilization, is essentially a massive, flat shelf of porous limestone jutting out into the Caribbean Sea. There are virtually no surface rivers here, none at all. For a society that grew to support millions of people, a lack of surface water would normally spell absolute disaster. But nature provided a hauntingly beautiful solution. Over millions of years, acidic rainwater ate away at the limestone bedrock, creating vast, winding underground cave systems and rivers. Occasionally, the roofs of these underground caverns would collapse, exposing the fresh, cool water below to the sky. These natural sinkholes are called cenotes. The word cenote comes from the Yucatec Maya word zonot, meaning sacred well. When you stand at the edge of a cenote, looking down into the perfectly still, sapphire-blue water. Surrounded by cascading green vines, you can instantly understand why the Maya viewed them with such profound reverence. They were not merely sources of drinking water. They were sacred portals, literal doorways to Xibalba, the shadowy underworld where the spirits of the dead and the powerful gods of rain and earth resided. I've always believed that the landscape a culture inhabits entirely shapes their soul. For the Maya, the earth was alive, breathing, and porous. Water didn't flow over it. It hid beneath it, requiring patience and deep respect to access. The Maya would often build their most magnificent cities, radiating outward from these life-giving cenotes. In the quiet hours of the morning, long before the fierce midday heat took hold, the women of the city would walk down stone steps, carved into the sides of the sinkholes, carrying heavy clay jars. You can almost hear the soft padding of their woven sandals on the cool limestone, the gentle splashing of water as they submerged their earthen vessels, and the quiet murmur of their morning conversations echoing off the cavern walls. Water was the ultimate currency of life, and Chak, the fearsome god of rain, who wielded a lightning axe to strike the clouds and release the rain, was one of the most deeply venerated deities in their pantheon. It is an amusing, deeply human thought that no matter how mathematically brilliant their astronomers were, they still anxiously watched the skies, hoping the rain god was in a generous mood. Agriculture was the beating heart of their society, and at the absolute center of their agricultural world was maize or corn. But to call maize just a crop is a tremendous understatement. To the ancient Maya, maize was quite literally the substance of life, according to their beautiful, poetic creation myth, found in the sacred text known as the Popol Vuh. The gods tried several times to create humanity. First, they tried to mold humans out of mud, but the mud simply melted away in the rain. Then, they tried carving humans out of wood, but the wooden people had no souls, no memories, and they forgot to honor their creators. Finally, the gods took yellow and white maize, ground it down into a fine dough, and mixed it with water. From this sacred dough, they sculpted the first true human beings. When you eat maize, you are partaking in the very flesh of your ancestors. This profound spiritual connection to their food meant that the act of planting and harvesting was not just physical labor. It was a deeply religious ceremony, an act of ongoing creation and gratitude. I imagine an early morning in a milpa, the traditional Maya agricultural field. The mist is still clinging to the low-lying shrubs. A farmer, his skin browned by the sun and dusted with dry soil, uses a simple, fire-hardened wooden digging stick to poke small, perfectly spaced holes into the earth. He doesn't just plant maize. He practices a sophisticated, sustainable method of companion planting that we now call the Three Sisters. In the same small hole, he places seeds of maize, beans, and squash. As the plants grow, they support one another in a brilliant, quiet symbiosis. The tall, sturdy stalk of the maize provides a natural pole for the climbing beans. The beans, in turn, pull nitrogen from the air and fix it into the soil, acting as a natural fertilizer. And the broad, heavy leaves of the squash plant spread out across the ground, blocking the harsh sunlight retaining the precious soil moisture and preventing weeds from taking root. It is a perfect, elegant system, born not in a laboratory, but from centuries of quiet, patient observation of how the natural world cooperates. They listened to the earth, and the earth rewarded them with abundance. As the day warms and the mist burns off, the vast scale of their civilization becomes apparent. The Maya were masterful engineers and architects manipulating the landscape on a staggering scale. Because there were no beasts of burden in Mesoamerica. No horses, no oxen, no wheeled carts. Every single stone of their towering pyramids, every block of their sprawling palaces, was cut, carried, and placed by human hands. I want you to hold that thought for a moment. Close your eyes and imagine the sheer physical devotion required to build a mountain of stone by hand. They used tools made of obsidian and jade, stones harder than steel, to cut the soft, yielding limestone bedrock. They burned limestone in massive kilns to create a durable, bright white stucco plaster that they used to coat their buildings, their plazas, and their roads. When a Maya city was at its peak, it was not the muted grey and green we see today. It was a dazzling, blindingly bright metropolis, painted in vibrant hues of blood red, deep sky blue, and brilliant yellow. Walking into a bustling plaza in a city like Tikal, at the height of its power, would have been an overwhelming sensory experience. The sheer scale of the limestone pyramids, reaching up toward the heavens, was meant to mimic the great, sacred mountains of creation. I often wonder what a weary traveler, emerging from the dense, shadowing jungle canopy for the very first time, must have felt when they were suddenly struck by the blinding sunlight, reflecting off those vast, red-painted plazas. It must have felt like stepping into the realm of the gods themselves. The air would be thick with the heavy, sweet smoke of burning copal incense, a rich, earthy scent that still lingers in the modern Maya villages today, carrying prayers up into the sky. The sound of deep, rhythmic drumming and the piercing, high-pitched melodies of wooden flutes would echo off the polished plaster walls, mingling with the calls of brightly colored macaws kept in large, woven wooden cages. At the absolute center of this vibrant, thrumming universe was the king, known as the Kuhul Ajar, or Holy Lord. The Maya king was not just a political ruler, a wealthy elite, or a military commander. He was the living, breathing conduit between the mundane world of mortals and the sacred, invisible realm of the divine. It was a heavy, tremendous burden to bear. The king was personally responsible for ensuring the sun rose, the rains fell, and the harvest was plentiful. To maintain this fragile cosmic balance, the royal family practiced deeply intimate rituals of sacrifice, most notably the shedding of their own blood. Now, when we hear the word sacrifice, our modern minds often jump to dark, gruesome imagery. But for the Maya, blood was the most precious, sacred substance in the universe. It was the absolute mortar that held the cosmos together. By offering drops of their own royal blood onto strips of bark paper and burning them in shallow ceramic bowls, they believed they were opening a swirling portal of smoke, allowing the ancestors and gods to manifest in the physical world, to offer guidance. It is a profound, almost beautifully poetic concept when you truly think about it. The idea that leadership required literal, physical sacrifice for the spiritual and physical well-being of the people. I always find myself smiling at the sheer complexity of their daily administration. To manage these sprawling, interconnected city-states, the Maya developed the most sophisticated and complete writing system. In the pre-Columbian Americas, it wasn't merely a system of accounting or simple pictograms used to count grain. It was a fully functional, wildly elaborate phonetic script made up of roughly 800 distinct hieroglyphs. These glyphs are astonishingly beautiful to look at. They look less like letters and more like tiny, intricate portraits of gods, animals, and mythological symbols, woven tightly together in square blocks. The scribes who painted and carved these glyphs were highly revered members of the noble class. I can easily picture a master scribe sitting cross-legged on a cool, shaded stone terrace, carefully grinding brilliant blue and red pigments in small, polished shell bowls. With a delicate brush made of animal hair, they would meticulously paint the history of their kings onto long, folding books made of flattened fig bark, covered in a thin, smooth layer of white lime. Sadly, only 4 of these incredibly fragile accordion-style books, known as codices, survived the heavy ravages of time, the humidity of the jungle, and the destructive fires of the Spanish conquest. When I reflect on that loss, I feel a deep, lingering ache in my chest for the vast libraries of knowledge, poetry, astronomy, and history that simply vanished into the smoke. But the Maya did not just write on fragile paper. They carved their history into the very bones of the earth. Towering, monolithic stone monuments called stelae were erected in the grand plazas to commemorate royal coronations, critical military victories, and the completion of major calendar cycles. Standing before one of these massive, intricately carved stones today is a deeply humbling experience, even worn smooth by 1,000 years of endless jungle reign. You can still feel the immense pride and the overwhelming presence of the king who commissioned it centuries ago. And reading these towering stones requires a deep understanding of something the Maya mastered better than almost anyone else in the ancient world: time. To the Maya, time was not a straight, endless line, marching endlessly forward into an unknown future. Time was entirely cyclical. It was a series of grand, interlocking wheels, turning beautifully within wheels, repeating endlessly in predictable, rhythmic patterns. To track these divine cycles, they developed a mathematical system that was brilliantly ahead of its time. Long before the mathematicians of Europe fully grasped the concept, the Maya independently invented the concept of zero. They used a simple but incredibly elegant vigesimal system, meaning it was based on the number 20 rather than our modern base 10 system. A simple dot represented 1, a horizontal bar represented 5, and a beautiful little drawing of a stylized snail shell represented 0. With just those 3 simple symbols stacked in columns, they could effortlessly calculate numbers running into the hundreds of millions. They used this profound mathematical prowess to turn their eyes toward the heavens. Maya astronomers did not have glass lenses or metal telescopes. Yet they charted the movements of the sun, the moon, and the wandering planets with a level of precision that is still shocking to modern astronomers today. They successfully mapped the complex, highly erratic path of Venus across the night sky to within a fraction of a day, over a period of hundreds of years. I love to imagine a wise astronomer priest standing at the very top of a towering stone observatory, known as a caracol, in the dead of the tropical night. The jungle below is a sea of absolute, breathless blackness, but above, the sky is a sprawling, vivid tapestry of sparkling silver diamonds. With nothing but the naked eye and a simple pair of crossed wooden sticks used as a sighting instrument, he patiently, quietly records the slow, celestial dance of the planets. To him, the bright stars are not merely burning balls of gas millions of miles away. They are the literal gods walking across the great vaulted ceiling of the world. By deeply understanding their movements, he could accurately predict the future, plan the harvest of the sacred maize, and schedule the vital sacred rituals that kept the universe alive and turning. Their architectural marvels were designed not merely to shelter people or display wealth, but to capture these celestial movements permanently in stone. At the great city of Chichen Itza, the majestic temple of Kukulkan, a massive step pyramid, was built as a physical, three-dimensional calendar. It possesses exactly 365 steps, perfectly matching the days of the solar year. But the true, stunning genius of its design is revealed only twice a year, during the spring and autumn equinoxes. On those specific afternoons, as the golden sun begins to set over the canopy, it casts a precise series of triangular shadows down the side of the grand northern staircase. These dark shadows seamlessly connect with a massive, beautifully carved stone serpent head resting at the base of the pyramid, creating the breathtaking, terrifying illusion of a giant, undulating snake slithering down from the heavens to bless the earth. Imagine standing in a massive crowd of thousands in that ancient, echoing plaza, holding your breath as the shadows slowly, magically align, watching the feathered serpent god descend precisely as your astronomer priests had promised. It is a profound marriage of art, mathematics, and unwavering faith that still commands quiet awe to this very day. But the heavens were not the only place the Maya looked to interact with the divine forces of the universe. They also found the sacred in the intense, rhythmic thud of a heavy rubber ball bouncing against the smooth stone walls of a sunken courtyard. When we think of sports today, we often think of them as mere entertainment or physical exercise. But for the ancient Maya, the ball game, known as pits, was a matter of cosmic survival. Almost every major Maya city possessed at least one ball court, easily recognizable by its distinct capital, eye shape, and its long, gently sloping stone walls that formed a narrow playing alley. The ball itself was made of solid, unvulcanized rubber, harvested from the sap of the Castilla elastica tree, and it was incredibly heavy, sometimes weighing up to 9 pounds. Because the ball was so dense and dangerous, players wore thick, heavy yokes around their waists, made of tightly woven cotton or wood, along with heavy knee and elbow pads to protect their joints. The rules were notoriously strict. Players could not use their hands or their feet to hit the ball. They had to use their hips, thighs, or upper arms to keep the heavy rubber sphere in constant, fluid motion, passing it back and forth without letting it touch the ground. I find it mesmerizing to think about the incredible athleticism and the sheer, bruising physical endurance this must have required. The sound of that dense ball striking a player's hip, followed by the sharp, echoing crack as it rebounded off the plastered limestone walls, must have sounded like thunder trapped within the city. To the Maya, this was not just a game, it was a visceral, highly dramatic reenactment of the sacred Popol Vuh creation myth, specifically the story of the hero twins who descended into the terrifying underworld of Xibalba to play a ball game against the Lords of Death. By keeping the ball in motion, the players were symbolically keeping the sun moving across the sky, ensuring the continuation of life on Earth. While some high-stakes games played by captive warriors did tragically end in ritual sacrifice, the vast majority of matches were likely played by young nobles to settle diplomatic disputes, forge alliances, or simply to celebrate a successful harvest. But to truly understand the heartbeat of this civilization, we must step away from the roaring crowds of the ball court, away from the towering royal pyramids, and wander down the quiet, winding dirt paths into the residential neighborhoods where the common people lived. The vast majority of the Maya population were not kings or astronomers. They were farmers, artisans, and weavers. They lived in simple, brilliantly adapted houses called na. These homes were usually oval or rectangular, built with walls of wattle and daub, woven vines and branches coated in smooth, wet clay, and topped with a steeply pitched roof made of thick, tightly woven palm thatch. This design was beautifully perfect for the jungle environment. The thatched roof repelled the heavy monsoon rains, while the porous clay walls allowed the cool evening breezes to filter through, keeping the interior comfortably dry and airy. If you were to peek inside one of these homes, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, you would be greeted by the warm, flickering glow of the hearth. The hearth was the absolute center of the Maya universe, the anchor of the family unit. It was always constructed of exactly 3 sacred stones arranged in a circle, mirroring the 3 stars of the Orion constellation, which the Maya believed formed the cosmic hearth of creation. I love to imagine the deeply comforting smells that would drift from that fire on a quiet evening. You would smell the rich, earthy aroma of maize dough being flattened into tortillas on a heated clay griddle, the sharp, smoky tang of roasting chili peppers, and the deep, savory scent of black beans simmering slowly in a clay pot. It reminds me that no matter how separated we are by time or geography, the simple, quiet comfort of a family, gathering around a warm fire to share a meal, is a universally human experience. As the early morning light filtered through the doorway the next day, the gentle, rhythmic clacking of wood against wood would echo through the small courtyard. This was the sound of the backstrap loom. Weaving was considered a sacred art form, overseen by Ixchel, the powerful goddess of the moon, water, and childbirth. A Maya woman would tie one end of her loom to a sturdy mahogany or cedar tree and secure the other end around her own waist with a thick, woven leather strap. By simply leaning back or forward, she could perfectly control the tension of the thousands of delicate cotton threads. The patience required for this work is almost impossible for our modern, fast-paced minds to comprehend. She would spend hours meticulously lifting and separating the vertical threads, sliding a wooden shuttle, carrying vibrantly dyed horizontal threads back and forth to create stunning, wildly complex geometric patterns. And the colors they achieved, using only the natural elements of the jungle, were nothing short of breathtaking. They extracted deep oceanic blues from the indigo plant, bright, sunny yellows from the bark of the mora tree, and brilliant, blood reds from cochineal, a tiny insect that lives on the prickly pear cactus. By crushing hundreds of these dried insects, they created a red dye, so vivid and permanent that it would later become one of the most fiercely sought-after exports. When the Spanish arrived, every textile told a profound story. The specific patterns, the colors, and the weaving techniques were not just choices of fashion. They were an intricate, silent language that communicated the weaver's lineage, her village, and her standing in the community. When a Maya family walked through the sprawling city markets, they were adorned in their own living, woven history. Those markets were the bustling, chaotic arteries that kept the Maya world alive and connected. Even without beasts of burden or wheeled carts, the Maya established vast, incredibly complex trade networks that stretched for thousands of miles from the dry, volcanic highlands of Guatemala all the way up to the flat, coastal plains of the Yucatan, and even reaching far into central Mexico. Imagine the overwhelming cacophony of a grand Maya market plaza at midday. The air would be filled with 1,000 voices, haggling in different dialects. Because they had no metal coins, they used a variety of highly valued goods as currency, the most famous of which was the cacao bean. It is a beautifully sweet thought that chocolate was quite literally money. A single carved jade bead, highly prized for its vibrant green color, that symbolized the life-giving maize plant, might cost hundreds of carefully counted cacao beans. Merchants would lay their goods out on woven palm mats directly on the warm plaster floor of the plaza. You would see piles of razor-sharp, translucent black obsidian blades brought down from the volcanic mountains, massive bundles of white sea salt gathered from the coastal lagoons, fragrant mounds of dried vanilla beans, and perhaps the most precious commodity of all, the iridescent, emerald-green tail feathers of the elusive quetzal bird. These feathers were so highly valued that killing a quetzal was strictly forbidden. The birds were carefully trapped, their longest tail feathers gently plucked, and then they were released back into the cloud forest to grow them again. As the intense heat of the afternoon finally began to break, giving way to the cool, purple shadows of dusk, market would slowly pack away. The merchants would shoulder their heavy packs, the weavers would return to their hearths, and the towering stone temples would catch the last fiery rays of the sun, standing as silent guardians over the sprawling, pulsing life of the jungle. As the shadows lengthened and the great city settled into the quiet embrace of the night, the Maya cosmology shifted its gaze from the heavens above, down into the damp, fertile earth below. When I think about how modern cultures view the world beneath our feet, it is often seen simply as dirt, as inanimate rock or empty soil. But to the Maya, the earth was a thin, fragile crust, sitting delicately above the swirling, mysterious waters of the underworld, known as Xibalba. Xibalba, which translates to the place of fright, was not a fiery hell in the way Western traditions often depict the afterlife. Instead, it was a dark, damp, labyrinthine realm of winding underground rivers, echoing caverns, and deep, still cenotes ruled by the lords of death. It was a place of trials, yes, but it was also the ultimate source of regeneration. The sun died every evening, descending into Xibalba to battle the lords of the dark, only to be reborn victorious every single morning in the east, anchoring this incredible three-tiered universe: the starry heavens above, the earthly plane of mortals in the middle, and the watery underworld below, was the magnificent ceiba tree, known as the yakche. The ceiba is one of the tallest trees in the Mesoamerican rainforest, a true living titan that can grow over 150 feet tall, its massive canopy bursting right through the thick jungle roof to touch the sky. Its enormous, thick roots spread out like giant wooden serpents, digging deep into the soft limestone, reaching down into the watery depths of Xibalba. I love to imagine a lone villager sitting quietly at the base of one of these ancient giants. In the cool night air, the sheer scale of the tree makes you feel incredibly small, but at the same time deeply connected to the entire pulsing universe. To the Maya, the souls of the dead would climb the slippery, towering trunk of the ceiba tree to reach the 13 levels of heaven. It was the literal axis of the world, the living pillar that held reality together. Because the boundary between the realm of the living and the realm of the dead was so incredibly thin, the Maya took profound, meticulous care in their burial practices. For the common people, this usually meant being buried directly beneath the packed clay floors of their own homes. I find this practice so incredibly touching and deeply human. They didn't cast their loved ones away into distant, lonely cemeteries on the outskirts of the city. They kept them close. The ancestors remained a vital, active part of the household, their spirits warming the family hearth and watching over the children playing in the courtyard. When a family member passed, their body was gently curled into a sleeping, fetal position, carefully wrapped in a simple woven cotton shroud and placed into the earth with a bowl of maize and a hollowed-out gourd of fresh water for their journey. Their mouth would often contain a single small bead of polished green jade. Jade, with its vibrant green hue, held the very essence of life and breath, ensuring the soul would have currency, vitality, and safe passage in the shadowy world to come. For the divine kings, however, the journey into the afterlife required architecture on a staggering, monumental scale. Deep beneath the towering limestone pyramids, completely hidden away from the light of the sun, archaeologists have discovered the deeply moving, breathtaking tombs of the royal elite. Perhaps the most famous of these belongs to Pakal, the great ruler of Palenque, when his tomb was finally opened in the mid-20th century. After being completely sealed in darkness for over 1,000 years, the heavy, humid air of the crypt revealed a sight that still gives me goosebumps just thinking about it. The damp stone walls of his subterranean chamber were lined with 9 striking stucco figures, the lords of the night, standing permanent, silent guard over his massive, carved sarcophagus. The king's body was covered entirely in a thick layer of bright crimson cinnabar powder. This vivid red mineral was profoundly sacred, symbolizing the life-giving blood of the East, the direction of the rising sun, and ultimate resurrection. But the most astonishing artifact was resting gently over his face. An intricate, masterfully crafted burial mask made of over 300 individual pieces of brilliant green jade, perfectly fitted together like a jigsaw puzzle to recreate the king's features. His eyes were made of white conch shell and dark obsidian, staring eternally upward. It is a humbling realization that this magnificent piece of art, undoubtedly one of the greatest masterpieces of the ancient world, was never meant to be seen by human eyes ever again. It was crafted entirely for the gods, a permanent, beautiful face for the king to wear, as he navigated the dark rivers of the underworld. As the king made his dangerous journey through Xibalba, he was not alone. The Maya believed that the dense jungle surrounding their cities was teeming with powerful spiritual entities, often taking the physical shape of the apex predators that stalked the shadows. The most revered and deeply feared of these was the jaguar, or Balam. I want you to picture the deep jungle at midnight. It is never truly quiet. The air hums with the electric buzz of cicadas and the distant, haunting roar of the monkeys in the canopy. And moving completely silently through the thick, wet ferns, practically invisible in the dappled moonlight, is the jaguar with its stunning, rosette-patterned coat, perfectly camouflaging it among the shadows. The jaguar was the ultimate symbol of royal power and nocturnal mystery. The Maya noticed that jaguars were equally comfortable, climbing high into the tall trees, swimming deep across the rushing rivers, and vanishing perfectly into the pitch-black caves. Because they could effortlessly cross these physical boundaries, the jaguar was seen as a powerful shamanic animal, a creature that could travel freely between the earthly realm and the underworld. Kings would proudly drape themselves in heavy jaguar pelts during sacred ceremonies, and their carved stone thrones often took the shape of these magnificent cats. When a king died, he was said to transform into a jaguar, prowling the dark, starry skies of the night, fiercely guarding his people while he awaited the dawn. Let's just listen to that jungle for a moment. Alongside the stealthy silence of the jaguar, the canopy above is ruled by the deep, guttural calls of the howler monkeys. If you have never heard a howler monkey in the wild, it is a sound you will never forget. It doesn't sound like a monkey at all. It sounds like a rushing wind, a deep, resonant, almost terrifying roar that can carry for miles across the thick, humid air. To the ancient Maya, these vocal monkeys were not just noisy animals. They were the divine patron gods of the scribes and artists. I've always found it quite charming that the loudest, most boisterous creatures in the entire forest were associated with the quiet, meticulous art of painting and writing. The Maya believed the monkeys possessed deep, ancient wisdom, echoing the voices of the ancestors down through the leafy canopy. The intricate, harmonious balance between the terrifying and the beautiful, between the deafening roar of the monkey and the silent grace of the jaguar, perfectly reflects how the Maya viewed their entire existence. It was a world of profound duality, where light and dark, life and death, noise and silence were not enemies, but essential partners in the grand, turning wheel of time. As that great wheel turned, measuring out the centuries in cycles of creation and decay, one of the most intimate, delicate ways we can still connect with the minds of the ancient Maya is not through the massive, immovable stone pyramids, but through the smooth, fragile surfaces of their painted pottery. When you hold a piece of Maya ceramics in your mind, you have to remember that these master artisans never used a potter's wheel. Every single vessel, every beautifully proportioned bowl, and tall, elegant cylinder vase was built entirely by hand, using the slow, deeply patient method of coiling clay. I often picture an older artisan sitting in the shade of a woven awning, his hands coated in fine, wet grey mud, gently smoothing the coils of a tall drinking vessel with a polished piece of gourd. It is a quiet, meditative process, a slow coaxing of form from the raw earth. Once the clay was bone dry, the painters would take over. They didn't use modern glazes. Instead, they painted with slips, which are essentially liquid clays, mixed with finely ground mineral pigments. Because they fired their pottery in open, smoky pits rather than in closed kilns, achieving the brilliant oranges, deep blacks, and rich, creamy whites, required an absolute mastery of temperature and airflow. The surviving cylinder vases from the classic period are nothing short of breathtaking. They serve as a brilliant, silent window directly into the royal courts. They are painted with incredibly dynamic, fluid scenes of palace life. Kings sitting on jaguar pelt thrones, leaning forward in conversation, lords receiving tributes of woven cloth, and mythical hero twins tricking the bloated lords of the underworld. Through these vessels, the stiff, formal figures carved on the stone monuments suddenly come alive, moving, laughing, and speaking. And the primary purpose of these magnificent tall cylinder vases was the preparation and consumption of chocolate. To the Maya elite, cacao was far more than just currency. It was a divine elixir. It is always fascinating to me how the ancient ancestor of our modern, sugary, comforting hot chocolate was actually a bitter, intensely spicy, and often cold concoction. The Maya would roast the cacao beans over a fire, grind them into a rich, oily paste on a curved stone meatate, and mix the paste with water, honey, fragrant vanilla, and fiery ground chili peppers. But the most important part of the drink was the foam. To achieve a thick, rich head of foam, a palace servant would stand and hold one vessel high in the air, pouring the dark liquid in a long, cascading stream into another vessel resting on the ground. They would do this over and over, back and forth, until a thick, luxurious froth formed on top. The foam was believed to hold the very spirit, the vital essence of the cacao. To sip that spicy, frothy drink in the cool shadow of a limestone palace was the ultimate symbol of royal privilege and earthly pleasure. Yet, beyond the shaded comfort of the palace walls, the Maya civilization was locked in a constant, high-stakes negotiation with a deeply unforgiving environment. When we picture the jungle today, we almost always imagine it soaking wet, dripping with endless rain. But the reality of the Mesoamerican climate is fiercely divided. From roughly January to May, the rains completely stop. This is the dry season, and it is brutal. The lush, emerald canopy slowly turns a dusty, parched brown. The smaller trees drop their leaves to conserve water. The thick mud of the jungle floor bakes into hard, cracked clay. The heat becomes a heavy, physical weight pressing down on the chest, and the air grows completely still. For a civilization numbering in the millions, living on a porous limestone shelf with absolutely no surface rivers or streams, a 4 to 5 month drought every single year should have meant absolute collapse. How did they survive? They survived through some of the most astonishing, quiet acts of hydraulic engineering in the ancient world. When you walk across the grand, flat plazas of a city like Tikal today, you might assume they are perfectly level, but they are not. The Maya architects deliberately, meticulously paved the entire city center on a very slight, almost imperceptible incline. They coated the plazas, the walkways, and the monumental staircases in a thick, impermeable layer of smooth, white plaster. When the torrential summer monsoons finally broke, the entire city acted as a giant, pristine funnel. Millions of gallons of fresh rainwater washed over the clean plaster, cascading down specialized stone channels and pooling into massive, deep reservoirs, quarried directly out of the limestone bedrock. I find it deeply moving to think about the immense foresight required to build a city this way. They literally sculpted their urban centers to catch the sky, but stagnant water in a tropical climate quickly becomes a deadly breeding ground for bacteria and disease. How did they keep millions of gallons of water pure and sweet to drink through the long, sweltering months of the dry season? Just recently, archaeologists made a stunning discovery at the bottom of the Corriental Reservoir in Tikal. They found thick layers of zeolite and crystalline quartz. Zeolite is a natural volcanic mineral that acts as a highly effective molecular sieve, filtering out heavy metals, harmful microbes, and toxins. The Maya had actively discovered and implemented a municipal water filtration system over 2,000 years before similar systems were developed in Europe. They traveled miles away to volcanic ridges, mined these specific filtering minerals, and strategically placed them at the intake channels of their reservoirs. The water flowing into the city's storage tanks was perfectly clean, clear, and safe to drink. As the dry season dragged on into the burning heat of April and May, you can imagine the collective anxiety of the city. The water levels in the great reservoirs would slowly, steadily drop, exposing the stained limestone walls. The plaster plazas would crack under the merciless sun. This was the time when the rituals reached their absolute peak. the kings and queens would perform their bloodletting ceremonies with renewed, desperate intensity, begging Chark, the rain god, to awaken from his slumber. The farmers would anxiously watch the sky, looking for the heavy, bruised, purple clouds to gather on the eastern horizon. The tension in the air would be thick enough to cut with an obsidian blade. And then, finally, the wind would shift. The sweet, heavy smell of ozone and damp earth would roll through the trees. The very first drops of rain, striking the dry, dusty plaster of the plaza, must have sounded like the most beautiful music in the world. The sudden, deafening chorus of thousands of frogs rising from the jungle floor signaled that the world was safe, the cycle was renewed, and life would continue for another year, with the reservoirs full and the maize fields turning a brilliant, vibrant green. The Maya city-states were not just centers of agriculture and astronomy, they were also fiercely competitive political engines. When I reflect on this period of their history, it becomes clear that times of plenty often breed the deepest rivalries. We often romanticize ancient civilizations as peaceful utopias entirely focused on stargazing and philosophy. But the Maya were as profoundly human as the rest of us. They loved, they built, they prayed, and they fought. However, their concept of warfare was vastly different from the total, scorched earth destruction we often see in later European history. For the classic Maya, war was a deeply ritualized, almost theatrical performance, intimately tied to their cosmology and the sacred necessity of captive sacrifice. There were no massive standing armies of nameless peasant soldiers marching in neat formations. Instead, the warriors were the nobility themselves. The kings, the princes, and the high-ranking lords were expected to lead from the front, proving their divine right to rule through physical bravery. I want you to imagine a procession of Maya elites preparing for a raid. They did not wear dull armor or camouflage. They wanted to be seen. They wanted to terrify their enemies with sheer, overwhelming visual splendor. They adorned themselves in elaborate headdresses made of carved wood and the shimmering, iridescent green feathers of the Quetzal bird, towering high above their heads. They wore thick, quilted cotton armor that had been soaked in salt water, which crystallized and hardened to form a surprisingly effective defense against projectiles. And over this, they draped the spotted pelts of jaguars, channeling the ultimate apex predator of the night. The weapons they carried were masterpieces of deadly craftsmanship. Because they did not forge metal for warfare, they turned to something much sharper. Volcanic glass. Obsidian. If you have never handled a fresh piece of napped obsidian, it is difficult to describe just how terrifyingly sharp it is. It can produce an edge that is literally just one molecule thick, far sharper than the finest modern surgical steel scalpel. I can almost hear the rhythmic, high-pitched clinking echoing from the artisan courtyards as master craftsmen expertly chipped away at the dark, glassy cores, using nothing but pieces of antler and rounded river stones. They would carefully embed these razor-sharp obsidian blades into the sides of heavy wooden clubs, creating a weapon known as a maquahuitl. In the hands of a skilled warrior, it was devastating. But the goal of a Maya battle was rarely to kill the enemy on the field. In fact, killing a high-ranking lord during a skirmish was often considered a massive failure. The true objective, the ultimate prize of war, was capture. To bring a rival king or a decorated general back to your own city alive, to strip him of his jade and feathers, and to hold him as a prisoner was the greatest political statement a ruler could make. It proved that your gods were stronger, that your bloodline was superior. These captives would often be held for years, sometimes even forced to play the sacred ball game in the opposing city's court before their inevitable ceremonial sacrifice. But this delicate, balanced ecosystem of competing city-states was profoundly shattered on one specific, highly documented day in the year 378 AD. I find this specific event to be one of the most thrilling, mysterious turning points in all of ancient history. It was a day that changed the Maya world forever. Deep in the jungle, the great city of Tikal was thriving under its king, Chak-Tok Ichak, whose name translates to Great Jaguar Paw. But hundreds of miles to the north, in the high, cold volcanic valley of central Mexico, a massive, towering metropolis known as Teotihuacan was turning its ambitious eyes toward the Maya heartland. According to the beautifully carved stone monuments, a powerful foreign general named Siaj Kak, which roughly translates to Fire is Born, arrived at the gates of Tikal. We don't know exactly what his army looked like as they marched out of the dense jungle foliage, but they were foreigners, dressed in a completely different style, carrying different weapons, and worshipping different gods. The inscriptions are chilling in their brief, blunt honesty. They state that on the very exact day Fire is Born arrived, the king of Tikal, Great Jaguar Paw, entered the water. This was a poetic Maya euphemism for death. There is no description of a grand battle, no poetic verses about a heroic final stand. The king simply died on the day the foreigners arrived. Fire is Born did not install himself as the new king. Instead, he acted as a kingmaker, an emissary of the supreme ruler of Teotihuacan, a shadowy figure known only as Spear-Thrower Owl. Within a year, Fire is Born had placed the young son of Spear-Thrower Owl onto the throne of Tikal, completely overthrowing the ancient, established royal bloodline. This political earthquake sent shockwaves through the entire jungle. The new regime brought with them entirely new styles of art, new architectural methods, and the imposing imagery of the goggle-eyed Mexican rain god, Tlaloc. For the next several centuries, this powerful alliance with the distant metropolis in the north would propel Tikal into an age of unprecedented dominance, turning it into the absolute superpower of the Maya world, heavily influencing trade, war, and the delicate balance of the jungle for generations to come. The shock of the Teotihuacan arrival did not break the Maya spirit. Instead, it acted like a fierce gust of wind feeding a growing fire. When I look at the centuries that followed, the period we now call the Classic Era, I see a civilization pushed to the absolute limits of its creative and intellectual power. Tikal, emboldened by its new northern alliances, began a massive campaign of expansion and monumental construction. But power in the jungle is never absolute, and it is never unchallenged. As Tikal grew, so did its rivals, hundreds of miles away, in the lush, rolling hills near the Usumacinta River. The great city of Palenque was rising. Palenque always feels different to me than the other Maya cities. If Tikal is a city of raw, towering intimidation, Palenque is a city of delicate, poetic grace. The architecture here is lighter, more intricate. The builders utilized a brilliant architectural innovation, known as the corbelled arch, by carefully overlapping flat limestone blocks closer and closer together until they met. At the top, they created tall, vaulted ceilings that made the interior rooms feel soaring and spacious, rather than dark and cramped. They decorated the exterior walls with the most beautiful, flowing stucco portraits found anywhere in the Maya world. But the true masterpiece of Palenque, the building that captures the imagination more than any other, is the Temple of the Inscriptions. This was the final resting place of Kingship Pakal, the king we spoke of earlier, the man with the brilliant jade mask. Pakal came to the throne when he was just 12 years old, during a time when Palenque had been devastated by a brutal attack from a rival city called Calakmul. His city was in ruins, its pride shattered. Yet, over his incredibly long, 68-year reign, he rebuilt Palenque into an architectural jewel. I often wonder what it must have been like for him, a child king, slowly watching his city rise from the ashes to become one of the most beautiful places on earth. He commissioned the Temple of the Inscriptions to be a monument to his own legacy, and he made sure no one would ever forget his story. The temple is named for the three massive limestone panels inside its upper chamber, which contain the second longest Maya hieroglyphic text ever discovered. Over 600 incredibly detailed glyphs tell the story of his royal lineage, meticulously connecting his bloodline not just to previous kings, but to the very gods who created the universe. But the true marvel of the temple is what lay hidden beneath the floorboards. For centuries, archaeologists believed that Mesoamerican pyramids were simply solid mounds of stone, built to support the temples on top, completely unlike the hollow burial pyramids of ancient Egypt. But in 1952, an archaeologist noticed something strange about the heavy flagstones on the floor of the upper temple. One of the stones had small holes drilled into the corners, perfectly designed to accommodate ropes for lifting. When they finally pried the stone up, they uncovered a dark, rubble-filled staircase, plunging directly down into the very heart of the pyramid. It took 4 exhausting, sweaty years to clear the massive amounts of heavy stone and earth blocking the descending tunnel. When they finally reached the bottom, they found a small, triangular doorway sealed by a massive stone block. Behind that block was the breathtaking royal crypt, the sarcophagus, and the jade mask. But the most fascinating detail of the entire crypt is perhaps the most subtle. Running all the way from the massive stone lid of the sarcophagus, snaking its way up the long, dark staircase, and finally emerging through the floor of the upper temple, the builders had constructed a hollow, beautifully crafted plaster tube. They called it a psychoduct. It was a literal speaking tube for the soul. I find this detail so profoundly moving. The Maya did not want their beloved king to be isolated in the dark, silent earth. The psychoduct allowed the priests, in the sunlit temple above, to whisper prayers, to burn sweet copal incense, and to speak directly into the ear of the sleeping king below. It ensured that the connection between the living and the ancestors was never completely broken by the heavy stone of the tomb. While Palenque was building delicate arches and speaking to the dead, a much darker, more intense drama was unfolding in the deep jungle to the east. Tikal was locked in a bitter, multi-generational war with the city of Calakmul. This conflict is often referred to as the Maya Star Wars because the major, decisive battles were timed to coincide precisely with specific astronomical events, most notably the heliacal rising of the planet Venus. When Venus appeared as the bright morning star, the Maya believed it was a highly aggressive, masculine entity, signaling the perfect time to strike. For over a century, these two massive superpowers, Tikal and Calakmul, fought a brutal proxy war, dragging dozens of smaller allied city-states into the conflict. Calakmul was a massive, sprawling beast of a city, often called the Kingdom of the Snake. Its rulers strategically encircled Tikal, allying with its neighbors to slowly choke off its trade routes. In the year 562 AD, the Snake Kingdom finally struck the decisive blow. Calakmul defeated Tikal in a major battle, capturing and sacrificing its king. What followed was a period known as the Tikal hiatus, a dark, silent gap in the city's history that lasted for 130 years. During this time, Tikal stopped carving stelae. They stopped building massive monuments. The city fell completely silent, seemingly crushed under the heel of the Snake Kings. If history ended there, it would be a tragic tale of defeat. But the Maya concept of time, as we know, is a circle. What falls must eventually rise again. In the year 695 AD, a new king arose in Tikal, a man named Jassar Chan Kawil. Under his fierce leadership, Tikal burst out of its long silence. In a massive, beautifully coordinated revenge attack, Jassar Chan Kawil decisively defeated the king of Calakmul, completely shattering the Snake Kingdom's grip on the region. To celebrate his incredible victory and the resurrection of his city, he commissioned the construction of Temple Y, the breathtaking, towering pyramid that still defines the Tikal skyline today. As he watched the first white limestone blocks being laid in the Grand Plaza, he must have felt an immense, profound satisfaction. He had not only restored the honor of his bloodline, he had ensured that Tikal would remain the undisputed master of the jungle for the rest of the classic era. The cycle had turned, the balance was restored, and the slow, rhythmic heartbeat of the Maya world continued to drum against the ancient limestone. As that heartbeat grew stronger, reaching the absolute zenith of the classic period, around the 8th century, the sheer scale of human presence in the jungle became something almost unimaginable. When we look at the quiet, vine-covered ruins today, it is so easy to picture them as isolated, lonely outposts. But at their peak, these were not just ceremonial centers. They were vast, sprawling megalopolises. I find it staggering to realize that the population density of the Maya lowlands during this time was actually higher than it is in that exact same region today. If you were to walk away from the grand, plastered plazas of Tikal or Calakmul, you would not immediately step into wild, untamed jungle. You would walk for miles and miles through endless, densely packed suburbs. The air would be thick with the wood smoke of tens of thousands of morning hearths, creating a permanent, hazy canopy of grey beneath the bright green leaves. To feed these millions of mouths, the simple, quiet milpa farms of the early days were no longer enough. The Maya engineers had to look at the vast, seemingly unusable seasonal swamps, known as bajos, and completely reimagine them. They didn't drain the swamps. They conquered them by building intricate, sprawling grids of raised earthen platforms surrounded by deep, water-filled canals. Imagine a farmer standing waist-deep in the cool, dark water of a canal just as the sun rises. With a woven basket, he scoops up the rich, nutrient-dense muck from the bottom and spreads it carefully over his raised field. This dark mud was essentially a perfect, natural fertilizer, allowing them to harvest 2 or even 3 crops of maize, beans, and cacao every single year without ever exhausting the fragile soil. It is a brilliant, entirely sustainable closed-loop system that modern agronomists are still studying with deep respect. It is a humbling reminder that sometimes the most advanced technology is simply a profound understanding of the mud beneath our feet. With this massive agricultural engine running smoothly, the cities had the immense wealth required to support a booming class of full-time artisans, musicians, and performers. Music, in particular, was the invisible mortar that held the spiritual and social life of the city together. They didn't have stringed instruments like guitars or violins. Instead, their music was driven by the deep, physical rhythm of percussion and the haunting, natural breath of wind. I love to close my eyes and try to hear a royal procession making its way down a white limestone road. You would first feel the deep, thudding vibration of the packs, a massive, upright wooden drum covered in stretched deerskin. It was beaten by a strong, focused musician using heavy rubber-tipped mallets, sending low frequencies vibrating right through the soles of your feet. Woven through that heavy, anchoring rhythm would be the sharp, rhythmic clacking of hollowed-out turtle shells. These were worn around the chest or held in the hand and struck with the polished, hard antlers of a deer, and soaring above it all, cutting effortlessly through the thick, humid jungle air, would be the piercing, mournful cry of the conch shell trumpet. To play the conch was to physically blow the breath of the ancient sea gods into the world. It produced a sound so loud, so deeply resonant, that it could be heard for miles across the green canopy, signaling to the distant suburbs that a sacred ritual was about to begin. But alongside these grand, public sounds were the quiet, deeply intimate melodies of the clay ocarina. These small, beautifully shaped ceramic flutes were often molded into the shapes of fat little birds, crouching frogs, or even sleeping jaguars. When a musician blew softly into the mouthpiece, the hollow clay would sing with a breathy, incredibly gentle tone. I imagine a Maya mother sitting by the glowing orange embers of her hearth late at night. The city outside is finally growing quiet, save for the cicadas. She is playing a slow, whispering, repetitive melody on a bird-shaped ocarina to help her children drift off to sleep, much like the stories we are sharing tonight. It is in these small, quiet moments, the smoothing of wet mud on a raised field, the rhythmic tapping of a turtle shell, the gentle breath moving through a clay bird, that the true, breathing soul of the Maya civilization is found, living quietly beneath the heavy shadows of the great stone pyramids. But as the quiet night slowly lifts and the first rays of the warm morning sun strike the smooth white plaster walls of the city, the Maya world awoke to a deeply profound ritual of personal preparation. When I think about how much time and energy we spend in our modern world worrying about our physical appearance, it is utterly fascinating to realize that the ancient Maya were also deeply, intensely focused on beauty. However, their concept of physical perfection was not driven by simple vanity. It was intimately, inextricably tied to the divine. To the Maya elite, the human body was not just a vessel for the soul. It was a living, breathing canvas that could be carefully sculpted to mirror the gods themselves. The most revered deity in their entire pantheon, as we know, was the Maize god. In Maya art, he is always depicted as breathtakingly beautiful, youthful, and vibrant, with a distinctively elongated, sloping forehead that perfectly mimics the graceful, tapering shape of an ear of corn. To honor him and to physically prove their divine bloodline, the Maya nobility practiced artificial cranial deformation. I know that to our modern sensibilities, the idea of reshaping a skull sounds frightening, but to a Maya mother, it was an act of profound, unconditional love. She wanted her child to be beautiful, to be recognized as noble, and to carry the very shape of the sacred harvest. I want you to imagine a peaceful, sunlit room in a noble household. A mother sits on a soft woven mat, holding her newborn infant gently in her lap. The baby is only a few days old, its bones still incredibly soft and pliable. With meticulous care and a gentle, soothing voice, she places two smooth, padded wooden boards on the infant's head, one pressing against the forehead, the other against the back of the skull. She then carefully binds them together with soft cotton cloth. Over the next several months, as the baby sleeps and grows, the skull will naturally, painlessly elongate upward and backward. When I reflect on this quiet, intimate process, I am struck by the sheer dedication it took to physically mold the next generation into the image of the divine. But the transformation of the head did not stop there. The Maya considered slightly crossed eyes to be a mark of extreme beauty and aristocratic elegance, likely because it was associated with Kinich-Ahau, the fiercely powerful sun god, who was often depicted with a similar gaze. It is a rather ingenious, if strange, method they used to achieve this look. While the infant was still in the cradle, the parents would hang a very fine string directly down the center of the child's face, suspending a tiny, polished bead of jade or a small ball of wax right between the baby's eyes. As the curious infant constantly focused on this dangling, swinging object, their eyes would naturally turn inward, permanently altering their gaze. As they grew into adulthood, as these children grew into teenagers, they underwent yet another astonishing physical transformation. One that required immense bravery and an incredibly high tolerance for pain. I am talking about dental modification. The Maya did not want plain white teeth. They wanted their smiles to literally sparkle with the wealth of the earth. In the cool shade of an artisan's courtyard, a skilled dental worker would have a noble client sit back comfortably against a padded rest. The artisan used a small, rapidly spinning bow drill, operated by pulling a string back and forth, to carefully bore tiny, perfectly round holes directly into the front enamel of the healthy incisors and canines. We have to remember, there were no anesthetics. The patient had to remain completely still, breathing deeply through their nose, as the friction of the drill ground down into the living tooth. Once the cavity was perfectly hollowed out, the artisan would take a tiny, meticulously shaped disc of brilliant green jade, dark obsidian, or shining iron pyrite and fit it seamlessly into the hole. They secured it using a remarkably advanced, durable cement made of plant sap mixed with crushed bone and calcium. The precision of this work is absolutely staggering. Modern dentists who have examined these ancient skulls are frequently left in complete awe. The Maya artisans almost never drilled too deep to hit the sensitive nerve, meaning these modifications rarely caused infection. When a Maya lord or lady finally stepped out into the blinding sunlight of the Grand Plaza, their appearance must have been nothing short of hypnotic. Their elongated heads were crowned with towering, intricate headdresses of quetzal feathers that swayed gently in the humid breeze. Their crossed eyes gave them a piercing, otherworldly stare, and when they smiled or spoke, their mouths flashed with the brilliant, starry glint of jade and pyrite. But this breathtaking beauty carried a massive, literal, physical weight. The nobility wore enormous, heavy ear spools that stretched their earlobes down to their shoulders. They wore massive collars made of hundreds of heavy jade beads that covered their entire chests. Wearing all this stone was exhausting. It was a physical burden meant to demonstrate their strength and their capacity to bear the heavy weight of the cosmos on behalf of their people. I often picture a king returning to the cool private chambers of his palace after a long, grueling public ceremony. The heavy jade collar is finally lifted off his shoulders. The towering wooden headdress is carefully removed and placed on a stand. You can almost feel the deep, heavy sigh of physical relief escaping his lips as he rubs his tired neck. Beneath all the intimidating jade, beneath the elongated skull and the shimmering feathers, they were still flesh and bone, still vulnerable to the extreme heat of the jungle, and still completely human in their exhaustion and their need for rest. And when rest was not enough, when the heavy dampness of the jungle seeped into their bones and brought fever or illness, they did not despair. They turned to the forest. I find it incredibly beautiful how the Maya viewed medicine. To them, illness was not simply a physical failure of the body. It was a spiritual imbalance, a severe disruption in the delicate harmony between the human soul and the unseen forces of the cosmos. To heal the body, you had to first heal the spirit, to realign the sick individual with the rhythmic, pulsing heartbeat of the universe. This sacred duty fell to the H-men, the traditional Maya healer and shaman. If you were to walk into the cool, dark sanctuary of a healer's hut, you wouldn't find metal surgical tools or sterile, empty walls. You would find an absolute explosion of botanical wonder. The woven wattle and daub walls would be lined from floor to ceiling with hanging, drying bundles of fragrant herbs, twisted, earthy roots, and heavy medicinal barks. The Mesoamerican rainforest was, and still is, one of the most biologically diverse pharmacies on the entire planet. And the ancient Maya had spent thousands of years quietly, patiently unlocking its deepest secrets. They knew exactly which broad leaves to crush into a soothing green poultice, to stop a wound from bleeding, which rough bark to boil into a bitter, dark tea, to break a soaring fever, and which rare, hidden jungle fungi could ease the heavy ache of arthritic joints. It reminds me that long before the advent of modern laboratories, humanity possessed a profound, intimate dialogue with the plant kingdom. They didn't just use the plants as tools. They communicated with them. A Maya healer would never simply rip a plant from the earth. They would always offer a quiet, deeply respectful prayer of gratitude, asking the spirit of the plant for permission to use its healing power, often leaving a small offering of corn or copal resin in the soil as payment. I want you to imagine a healing ritual taking place, just as the heavy, bruised purple twilight settles over a small village. A patient burning with fever is lying on a soft, woven palm mat in the center of the room. The air is incredibly thick, with the sweet, intoxicating smoke of copal incense purifying the space and inviting the benevolent ancestors to enter. The healer, an elder with deep, craggy lines of wisdom etched into their face, kneels beside the mat. They begin to chant in a low, rhythmic, almost hypnotic murmur that vibrates through the damp air. They rhythmically sweep bundles of fresh, highly aromatic basil and rue leaves over the patient's resting body. This sweeping motion wasn't just symbolic magic. The strong, sharp essential oils released from the bruised leaves possess genuine, scientifically proven antimicrobial and deeply calming properties. The scent alone would slow the patient's racing heart and ease them into a restorative, healing sleep. It is fascinating and deeply humbling how often modern science eventually catches up to ancient wisdom. For example, the Maya extensively used the bark of the willow tree to treat severe headaches and joint inflammation. Centuries later, European chemists would isolate the active compound in willow bark, salicylic acid, to create what we now call aspirin. The Maya had been using it effectively for over a millennia. But for the most severe spiritual imbalances, for sicknesses that would not break, the healing required a much deeper, more dangerous journey. The healer had to literally leave their physical body behind and travel the dark, winding, subterranean rivers of Xibalba to retrieve the patient's lost or stolen soul. To achieve this profound state of trance, they utilized powerful, sacred entheogens found deep in the shadows of the forest. One of the most potent and sacred of these was derived from the parotoid glands of the giant cane toad, a massive, heavy amphibian that emerges from the mud during the heavy summer rains. When collected and processed with absolute precision, the secretions of this enormous, warty toad produce intense, deeply spiritual visionary states. I picture the shaman sitting cross-legged by the flickering, low light of the hearth fire, the rest of the hut swallowed in absolute darkness. As the sacred medicine slowly takes hold, the physical world melts away. Their eyes roll back, and their breathing becomes incredibly shallow, matching the slow, pulsing, tectonic rhythm of the earth itself. In their mind's eye, they are transforming. They grow the spotted pelt of the jaguar. They sprint through the shadowy, echoing forests of the underworld, negotiating fiercely with the terrifying lords of death to release the sickness that is gripping their patient. To the worried family watching over the silent, entranced body of the healer, the wait must have been agonizing. The hut is completely silent, save for the crackling of the embers and the endless, rhythmic chirping of the night insects outside the doorway. They wait in the darkness, placing their absolute faith in the spiritual strength of the elder. But when the shaman finally returns to the waking world, drawing in a sudden, sharp, desperate breath of air, the entire room floods with an overwhelming sense of relief. The shaman's eyes open, weary but triumphant. The balance of the universe has been successfully restored. The sickness has been bargained away in the dark, left behind in the watery depths of Xibalba. This profound, daily reliance on the natural world meant that the Maya were acutely, intensely aware of the fragile balance of their environment. Every massive mahogany tree, every twisting green vine, every wandering jaguar possessed a vital spirit, a necessary role in the great, endlessly turning wheel of existence. They understood that to harm the jungle was to harm themselves. But as we slowly approach the twilight of the classic period, an unsettling, heavy silence begins to creep into the archaeological record. The grand, sprawling megalopolises, which had been meticulously sustained for over 6 centuries, through a perfect, delicate harmony with the fragile jungle soils, were about to face a cascading crisis that neither the brilliant, stargazing astronomers nor the wise, trance-walking healers could prevent. The collapse of the classic Maya is perhaps one of the most misunderstood mysteries in all of human history. When we hear the word collapse, our minds instantly conjure up apocalyptic images of sudden, catastrophic doom. We imagine a massive earthquake, a sudden plague, or a dramatic, overnight disappearance into the mists of legend. For decades, popular culture has loved to spin wild theories about alien abductions or mysterious vanishing acts. But when I look closely at the archaeological record, the truth is far more grounded, far more human, and in many ways, far more tragic. They didn't vanish into thin air. They didn't simply pack up their cities and walk away on a Tuesday. The collapse of the classic Maya was a slow, agonizing, centuries-long systems failure, brought on by the very things that had made them so incredibly successful in the first place. The root of the crisis was, ironically, their own immense prosperity. By the late 8th century, the population of the Maya lowlands had exploded. The delicate, perfectly balanced agricultural system of the raised beds in the swamps and the milpa clearings in the forest was being pushed far past its breaking point. There were simply too many mouths to feed. To create more farmland, the farmers had to cut deeper and deeper into the old-growth jungle. But agriculture was not the only thing devouring the forest. It was their absolute obsession with monumental architecture and the blinding white plaster that coated every surface of their cities. I want you to truly think about the terrifying mathematics of making that beautiful white stucco. To produce just 1 single ton of limestone plaster, the Maya had to chop down and burn up to 20 tons of fresh, green wood in their massive, roaring kilns. Now, multiply that by the thousands of sprawling temples, the endless miles of raised white roads, and the vast, paved plazas of dozens of competing megacities. The hunger for wood was utterly insatiable. The laborers worked endlessly, their stone axes ringing out through the shrinking forest, felling the magnificent, ancient mahogany and cedar trees that had stood for centuries. I can imagine a weary laborer standing on a deforested hillside on the outskirts of Copan or Tikal. He looks out over a landscape that was once a vibrant, breathing sea of green, now reduced to a scarred, dusty expanse of tree stumps and the choking, thick black smoke of the endless lime kilns. This massive, unyielding deforestation triggered a deadly, unintended consequence. The Maya did not realize that the vast jungle canopy was actually creating its own weather. The millions of broad leaves acting together transpired massive amounts of moisture back into the humid air, actively pulling the heavy rain clouds down from the sky. When the trees were violently stripped away, the local microclimate fundamentally shifted. The earth grew hotter, the air grew drier, and then the cyclical rains simply stopped coming. Climatologists have recently taken core samples from the deep mud at the bottom of nearby lakes, and what they found is truly chilling. Right at the height of Maya overpopulation, the Yucatan Peninsula was hit by the most severe, punishing drought the region had seen in thousands of years. Picture a farmer walking out to his raised field in the dry, cracked swamp. The deep, water-filled canals that had sustained his grandfather and his great-grandfather are completely bone dry. The dark mud baked into hard, pale clay. He kneels down in the blinding, merciless heat and touches the withered, yellowed stalks of his maize crop. The ears of corn are stunted, the kernels shriveled and dry. There is no water in the reservoirs. There is no water in the sky. It is a slow, creeping starvation that settles over the rural neighborhoods like a heavy, suffocating blanket. In the grand, plastered plazas of the city centers, the desperation must have been absolute. Remember, the entire political and spiritual authority of the divine king rested on one single, critical promise. He was the bridge to the gods. He was the one who ensured the rains would fall. As the drought dragged on year after year, turning the sky into a mocking, cloudless dome of burning blue, the kings frantically intensified their rituals. The smoke of copal incense burned day and night. The bloodletting ceremonies became more frequent, more desperate, and more public. I imagine a king standing at the very top of his highest pyramid, dressed in his heaviest, most magnificent jade and feathers, performing the sacred dances under the blistering sun. He pierces himself, offering his sacred royal blood to the thirsty earth, begging Chark to open the heavens. But the sky remains stubbornly, terrifyingly clear. When I reflect on this moment, I feel a profound sense of pity for those rulers. To watch your people slowly starve, to perform every sacred duty, exactly as your ancestors taught you, and to be met with nothing but absolute, crushing silence from the gods must have been a psychological torment beyond our understanding. When the rain failed, the divine mandate of the kings shattered. The common people, hungry, thirsty, and exhausted, slowly began to lose faith in the towering stone monuments and the men who built them. The delicate, ritualized warfare of the earlier centuries, fought for prestige and captive-taking, rapidly devolved into vicious, desperate struggles for sheer survival. Cities turned on each other in a frantic scramble to control the last remaining cenotes and the few fertile patches of land. The great trade networks broke down. The beautiful, glowing white roads were reclaimed by the dust. One by one, the grand, pulsing hearts of the southern lowlands simply stopped beating. In city after city, the scribes abruptly stopped carving the dates onto the stone stelae. Construction on massive temples was halted mid-sentence, leaving half-carved blocks sitting abandoned in the quiet plazas. The people did not vanish. They simply walked away. They gathered their families, packed whatever they could carry, and began a long, sorrowful migration away from the dry, failing heartland. They walked north toward the coastal areas where there was still water, abandoning the grand, silent pyramids to the slow, creeping embrace of the jungle vines. The jungle is incredibly, beautifully patient. As the last echoes of human footsteps faded from the great plazas of the south, the forest began its slow, quiet work of reclamation. Tiny seeds, carried on the humid wind or dropped by passing birds, found their way into the microscopic cracks of the blinding white plaster. Within a single generation, those tiny seeds became thick, muscular roots, slowly prying apart the massive limestone blocks that had taken decades of human sweat to assemble. The bright red and blue paint was washed away by the returning rains, and the towering pyramids were softly swallowed by a thick, heavy blanket of green moss and creeping vines. I find a strange, deep comfort in this image. It is a profound reminder that the earth always heals itself, quietly folding our greatest ambitions back into the soil. But the Maya themselves did not disappear into the soil. They were survivors. I want you to imagine that long, arduous migration north. Families walking for weeks, carrying only what they could strap to their backs, leaving behind the only homes they had ever known. They moved away from the deep, rolling hills of the southern rainforest and walked up onto the flat, dry, scrubby limestone shelf of the northern Yucatan Peninsula. The landscape here was vastly different. There were fewer towering mahogany trees, replaced by dense, thorny scrub and low-lying dry forests. The soil was incredibly thin, barely a scratch over the hard white bedrock. Yet, they did not just survive in this new, harsher environment. They completely reinvented themselves. As the southern cities fell silent, new, magnificent cities began to rise in the north. Cities like Uxmal, Kaba, and the sprawling, cosmopolitan metropolis of Chichen Itza. The architecture of this era, particularly the style known as Puk, is some of the most breathtakingly intricate stone work in the entire ancient world. Instead of focusing entirely on towering height, the architects in the north began to focus on sprawling width and incredibly elaborate, mosaic-like facades. If you were to stand before the governor's palace at Uxmal in the late afternoon sun, you would be absolutely mesmerized. The upper half of the building is covered in thousands of individually carved, perfectly fitted pieces of stone, creating a mesmerizing, undulating geometric pattern that looks more like woven cloth than solid rock. And woven into this stone tapestry, repeated over and over again, is a single inescapable motif: the face of Chak, the rain god. His distinct, curling, elephant-like snout juts out from the corners of the buildings, his wide eyes staring out over the dry plains. When I look at those hundreds of stone faces, I see the deep, lingering trauma of the collapse. The people who built these northern cities were the children and grandchildren of the great drought. They covered their new homes in the face of the rain god, a permanent, desperate prayer carved into stone, begging him never to abandon them again. But while they carved the old gods into their new temples, their political soul had fundamentally shifted. The absolute, unquestioned authority of the single divine king had been completely shattered by the drought. The people had seen that the blood of a single man could not force the clouds to rain. So, they adapted. In places like Chichen Itza, we begin to see a shift away from the glorification of a single royal ruler and toward a system called multipal, which translates roughly to joint or council rule. It is a deeply fascinating, pragmatic evolution. Power was no longer held solely by a single god-king, but was shared among a council of elite lords, high priests, and wealthy merchants. It was a slightly more democratic, deeply political reaction to a spiritual failure. This pragmatic shift in leadership completely opened the Maya world to new horizons. Rather than fighting endless, ritualized wars in the deep jungle, the lords of the north turned their eyes toward the turquoise waters of the Caribbean Sea. The Maya became the master navigators and merchants of Mesoamerica. Because the northern Yucatan is a peninsula, it acts as a massive natural pier jutting out into the ocean. The Maya began to construct enormous, ocean-going dugout canoes. Some of these vessels were large enough to hold over 40 rowers and massive amounts of heavy cargo. I love to picture one of these great canoes gliding silently along the coast just after sunrise. The water is that breathtaking, clear, glass-like Caribbean blue. A crew of strong, sun-darkened rowers pulls their wooden oars in perfect, rhythmic unison, hugging the lush, green coastline. They were moving staggering amounts of wealth. They traded massive cakes of white sea salt gathered from the northern lagoons, sweet honey from their stingless bees, finely woven cotton textiles, and the ever-precious cacao beans. They paddled these great canoes all the way down the coast of Belize, down to Honduras, and perhaps even further, connecting the Maya world to the vast, pulsing trade networks of Central America and beyond. They were no longer just a civilization of the deep jungle. They had become a vibrant, pragmatic civilization of the sea, proving that their spirit was as resilient and adaptable as the water they now sailed. That vast, pulsing trade network did more than just move salt and honey. It moved ideas, transforming the northern cities into incredibly vibrant, cosmopolitan melting pots. When I think about the sheer cultural diversity of a city like Chichen Itza, at its absolute height around the 10th century, I realize it wasn't just a classic Maya city anymore. It had become something entirely new, a brilliant synthesis of different worlds, because they were trading so far and wide, merchants, pilgrims, and warriors from all over Mesoamerica were walking down its broad, white limestone roads. You would hear dozens of different dialects being spoken in the grand market plazas. To truly understand the magnetic pull of Chichen Itza, we have to walk away from the Great Pyramid and follow an ancient, raised causeway that leads a few hundred yards straight into the low scrub forest. At the end of this road, the earth simply drops away into a massive, yawning limestone sinkhole. This is the sacred Cenote, the well of sacrifice. Standing at the edge of this sheer drop today is a profoundly humbling, almost eerie experience. The water below is a deep, opaque jade green, completely still and heavily shadowed by the thick ring of trees hanging over the limestone lip. To the ancient people of the Yucatan, this was not just a water source. This was the most sacred, powerful portal to the underworld in all of the north. For centuries, pilgrims traveled hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles, just to stand exactly where we are imagining right now. They came to offer their most precious possessions to Chak, who was believed to live at the very bottom of the dark water. When archaeologists finally dredged this cenote in the early 20th century, what they pulled up from the thick mud was absolutely staggering. They didn't just find local limestone or Maya jade. They found delicate, beaten gold discs that had been crafted all the way down in the jungles of Panama and Colombia. They found bright blue turquoise that had been mined in the distant, arid deserts of the American Southwest. This single, quiet pool of water holds the physical proof of an ancient, interconnected continent. Of course, the offerings were not only objects. The heavy silence of the cenote also held the remains of human beings. Men, women, and children who were given to the water in times of desperate drought or crisis. I find it difficult, as a modern person, to reconcile the breathtaking beauty and mathematical genius of this civilization with the stark reality of human sacrifice. But to understand them, we must try to see the world through their eyes. To them, giving a life to the water was not an act of murder. It was the ultimate, agonizing act of devotion, a desperate exchange meant to ensure the survival of the entire community. This intense, heightened atmosphere of devotion and foreign influence eventually brought a new, powerful mythology into the city. The stories tell of a great bearded leader who arrived from the distant west, a man the Maya called Kukulkan, which translates to the feathered serpent. He is identical to the great god Quetzalcoatl from the highland deserts of central Mexico. Whether Kukulkan was a real, historical conqueror, or simply a shared myth that traveled along the trade routes, his arrival completely changed the face of Chichen Itza. The architecture suddenly shifted, reflecting this fierce, new, hybridized identity. If you walk through the Temple of the Warriors, you are no longer looking at the gentle, poetic stucco faces of Palenque. You are surrounded by hundreds of massive, square stone columns, each one meticulously carved with the rigid, imposing figure of a heavily armed Toltec warrior. The art became sharper, more focused on the militaristic orders of the eagle and the jaguar. They built massive zompantlis, or skull racks, carving hundreds of terrifyingly realistic skulls into the stone platforms to display the severed heads of sacrificial victims and defeated enemies. The North had survived the Great Drought, yes, but the trauma of that survival had hardened them. They were no longer just stargazers and farmers. They were fierce, pragmatic survivors, blending the ancient wisdom of the jungle with the hard, martial discipline of the desert. But even this fierce, hybridized power in the North could not last forever. The grand, cosmopolitan experiment of Chichen Itza eventually fractured and faded by the 13th century. The political center of gravity in the Yucatan shifted one last time, settling a bit further to the west in a heavily fortified, incredibly dense city called Mayapan. When I look at the layout of Mayapan, it feels entirely different from the sprawling, open majesty of Tikal, or the artistic grace of Palenque. Mayapan was a walled city, encircled by a massive, thick stone defensive perimeter. Inside those walls, it was utterly packed. Over 4,000 simple houses, shrines, and small temples were crowded together in a chaotic, tangled web of winding alleys and tight courtyards. There were no massive, towering pyramids here that pierced the clouds. The architecture was smaller, more hurried, and in many ways much less refined. The beautiful, smooth white plaster was replaced by rougher, thicker coats of stucco, meant to hide the hasty stonework beneath. The lords of Mayapan ruled the northern peninsula through a tense, fragile confederacy, and their method of maintaining peace was brilliantly, ruthlessly pragmatic. They forced the rulers of all the surrounding provinces to live inside the walls of Mayapan, effectively holding them and their families as comfortable, well-fed hostages. As long as the regional lords were trapped within the city, their home provinces would not dare to rebel. For over 200 years, this tense, suffocating political arrangement held the Maya world together. But a peace built on captivity is always a fragile thing, constantly waiting for a single spark to ignite the dry tinder. That spark finally came in the mid-15th century, led by a rival noble family known as the Shu. In a sudden, violent, and bloody uprising, the Shu slaughtered the ruling Kokom family and completely sacked the walled city. The great wooden gates were burned, the temples were abandoned, and the captive lords finally fled back into the deep forests to reclaim their ancestral homelands. This was the final, devastating shatter of Maya political unity. The peninsula broke apart into roughly 16 small, fiercely independent, and constantly warring provinces. There was no longer a single great capital, no absolute superpower to dictate trade or coordinate massive building projects. The world grew much smaller, much more localized. The people returned to their quiet villages, tending their milpas, weaving their cotton, and watching the skies, just as their ancestors had done thousands of years before. The jungle, ever patient, began to swallow the broken walls of Mayapan. I often wonder what it must have felt like to live in one of those coastal villages during the early 16th century. For generations, the only sails they had ever seen on the horizon were the familiar, woven cotton sails of their own great dugout trading canoes. But then the prophets and the priests began to speak of strange, terrifying omens. The ancient books, tracking the great, turning wheels of time, suggested that a massive, world-altering shift was approaching from the east. It is a haunting coincidence of history that the Maya calendar, which had accurately predicted the movements of Venus and the eclipses of the sun for millennia, seemed to perfectly anticipate the absolute end of their isolated world. And then, one humid morning, a coastal fisherman or a salt gatherer, looking out over the Caribbean Sea, would have seen something entirely incomprehensible. Out on the deep blue water, far beyond the safety of the barrier reef, massive, floating wooden mountains appeared, propelled by billowing white clouds of canvas. These were, of course, the Spanish galleons. The first major contacts were fleeting and violent. Spanish explorers, desperate for gold and fresh water, would land on the beaches, read a proclamation in a language the Maya could not understand, and attempt to claim the earth for a distant king they had never heard of. The Maya warriors, hardened by decades of infighting, fiercely resisted. They met the strange men in their heavy, shining metal armor, with a hail of arrows and the terrifying, bone-crushing swing of the obsidian-bladed Makua Hutul. The early Spanish expeditions were often violently repelled, pushed back into the sea by a people who absolutely refused to be conquered. But the Europeans had unknowingly brought a weapon far more devastating than their steel swords, their loud, smoking muskets, or their terrifying, massive horses. They brought an invisible, silent enemy that marched far ahead of their armies, slipping effortlessly along the ancient, pulsing trade routes. Smallpox, measles, and influenza. Diseases that had circulated in the crowded cities of Europe for centuries, leaving the survivors with inherited immunity, were completely alien to the Mesoamerican immune system. The impact was nothing short of apocalyptic. I want you to picture those vibrant, bustling trade routes we spoke of earlier. The merchants carrying salt, honey, and cacao from village to village were now unknowingly carrying a microscopic death. The sickness swept through the dense jungle communities like a wild, invisible fire. It did not care if you were a divine king, a master astronomer, or a humble farmer. It took the young, the old, the strong, and the wise with a terrifying, indiscriminate speed. Entire villages were simply emptied. The elders, the ones who held the vast, encyclopedic knowledge of the medicinal plants, the complex calendars, and the sacred rituals, were wiped out in a matter of months. When I reflect on this profound tragedy, the sheer, unimaginable scale of the loss is staggering. It is estimated that in some regions, over 90% of the indigenous population perished from disease before a Spanish conquistador ever even set foot in their town. The psychological toll of this invisible devastation must have been absolute. To watch your entire family, your friends, and your leaders succumb to a burning, agonizing fever that no shaman's chant, no herbal poultice, and no desperate prayer to the gods could cure, would utterly shatter your understanding of the universe. By the time the Spanish finally returned in force, determined to carve out a new empire in the harsh limestone of the Yucatan, they were not fighting the magnificent, sprawling civilization that had built Tikal or Chichen Itza. They were fighting the grieving, exhausted survivors of the greatest demographic catastrophe in human history. Yet, even in the face of this overwhelming darkness, the Maya spirit, deeply rooted in the rhythmic, eternal cycles of the earth, refused to simply disappear into the ashes. The conquest of the Maya was not a single, decisive battle, but a grueling, deeply fragmented struggle that lasted for nearly 2 centuries, because the Maya had no central capital for the Spanish to simply capture and decapitate. The European invaders had to fight for every single inch of the dense, unforgiving jungle. The last independent Maya stronghold, an island city called Tayasal, hidden deep in the Petén Basin of northern Guatemala, did not finally fall to the Spanish until the year 1697. That is absolutely astounding to me. That is over a century and a half after the fall of the mighty Aztec Empire in Mexico. For over 150 years, while European galleons sailed the oceans and the Renaissance transformed the Old World, an independent, sovereign Maya kingdom was still quietly observing the ancient calendar deep in the rainforest. But the most devastating blow of the conquest was not struck with a sword. It was struck with a torch. In July of 1562, a Spanish friar named Diego de Landa, driven by a fierce, misguided zeal to eradicate the ancient religion, gathered thousands of sacred Maya objects in the town of Mani. Among these objects were dozens, perhaps hundreds, of the incredibly rare, beautifully painted bark paper codices. These books contained the accumulated wisdom of thousands of years, their poetry, their mathematics, their profound botanical knowledge, and the intricate histories of their ancestors. Landa ordered them all to be burned as the flames consumed the delicate, white-limed pages. The Maya, who were forced to watch, wept bitterly in the smoke. I can barely let my mind dwell on that moment without feeling a profound, heavy ache. It was the intentional erasure of a civilization's memory, a library of human brilliance, turning into pale, floating ash in the humid afternoon breeze. Because of that single fire, today we only have 4 surviving Maya books in the entire world. But memory, much like the jungle itself, is incredibly difficult to completely destroy. When I think about the legacy of the Maya, the greatest misconception is that they are a lost people, a vanished race, relegated only to dusty museums and silent, vine-covered ruins. Nothing could be further from the truth. The Maya never left. Today, there are over 6 million Maya people living in Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras. They are not relics of the past. They are a vibrant, living, breathing culture. If you travel into the highlands of Guatemala today, you will still hear the beautiful, clicking consonants of the ancient languages echoing through the bustling mountain markets. You will see women sitting patiently at their backstrap looms, weaving the exact same brilliant, complex geometric patterns in indigo and cochineal red that their ancestors wove 1,000 years ago. In the quiet, misty mornings, you will still find farmers walking out into their milpas with wooden digging sticks, planting the sacred yellow and white maize in the same rich, dark earth, whispering the same quiet prayers of gratitude to the soil and the rain. The Spanish may have changed their politics and introduced new names for their gods, but the profound, deeply rooted rhythm of Maya daily life, the planting, the weaving, the honoring of the ancestors, never truly stopped. As we bring our journey to a close tonight, I want you to let go of the wars, the dates, and the heavy stones. Let your mind travel back one last time to the deep emerald heart of the Mesoamerican rainforest. The sun has set over the towering, silent canopy. The heat of the day has finally lifted, replaced by a cool, gentle breeze that rustles the broad, waxy leaves of the great cebot tree. The jungle is singing its ancient, hypnotic lullaby. You can hear the rhythmic, pulsing chirp of the cicadas, blending with the distant, haunting call of a night bird. High above the canopy, the sky is completely clear, revealing a breathtaking, endless river of silver stars. These are the exact same stars the astronomer priests watched so patiently from their high stone observatories. They are the same stars that guided the lone merchants along the glowing white limestone roads. The Maya understood, perhaps better than anyone else, that time is just a grand, beautiful circle. The sun goes down into the dark waters of the underworld, but it always rises again. The heavy rains wash away the plaster. The vines pull down the stones, and the earth quietly, gently reclaims its own. There is a profound peace in knowing that we are all just a small part of this endless, turning wheel. The empires rise and fall, the centuries slip away, like water over smooth limestone. But the essential heartbeat of the earth remains constant, steady, and secure. As you lie there, let your own breathing fall into sync with that ancient, slow rhythm. Inhale the cool, fragrant night air of the forest. Exhale all the heavy burdens and the hurried thoughts of your day. The ancestors are sleeping peacefully beneath the roots. The great jaguar is resting in the deep shadows. The sacred fire in the hearth has burned down to a soft, warm, glowing amber. Everything is quiet. Everything is perfectly balanced. It is time for you too to rest.